Today I'm going to be talking about kind of my broader dissertation project, which is looking at how we've seen kind of changes in discourse and rhetoric and changes in electoral performance by radical right parties in Western Europe. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, we've seen radical right-wing movements and parties have existed throughout, but they've had varying levels of success and prominence within different European societies based on time and country context. And through academic and popular discourse, these parties have largely been characterized by their anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and misogyny, and are mostly conceived of as a unified bloc of vehemence, largely antithetic to the pluralism and tolerance that we associate with liberal democracy. And so the recent surge in the visibility and success of these parties has been troubling to academics and citizens alike, and that's kind of where I kind of began my research. And so what I personally have found the most troubling is the shift that these parties have made in their rhetoric and discourse with respect to particular marginalized and underrepresented groups, particularly Jews, women, and members of the LGBT community, and how they have used these groups as a shield and a safeguard from accusations of intolerance. So I'll open with a quote given a few years ago by Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front in France. So she says, "I keep saying to French Jews, who are more and more likely to turn to us, not only is the National Front not your enemy, but it is without a doubt the best shield to protect you. You'll find it at your side for the defense of our freedoms of thought and worship when faced with the sole true enemy, Islamic fundamentalism." And so these parties are largely using this new threat of the bad Muslim as a threat to these other groups, which previously were not considered to be particularly legitimate parts of these national cultures. Now we can rally them as a way of solidifying against this new, worse other. And so I'll talk a little bit about the extant literature on the radical right, the theory that I'm working with, the research design I'm employing, a few thoughts on the fieldwork that I've done so far, on interviews with politicians from and activists from the National Front in France and from the Alternative for Germany in Germany, and then a few conclusions kind of at this stage and the questions that I'm still sort of struggling with. So largely the study of the radical right has relied on either demand or supply side explanations. So the demand side explanations tend to look to the voter, looking at how changes in large macro socioeconomic changes have led to different configurations of voting populaces for these parties. So by and large, these tend to look towards the so-called losers of globalization, people that have been left behind either economically or socially by these processes of Europeanization and globalization. However, these tend to assume that these parties are largely uniform, and it's not clear who these losers are, whether or not this is something that changes. And as we all know from studying questions of power and violence and inequality, there are always going to be grievances, and they're not always necessarily manifested in votes. So supply side explanations have looked more towards the parties themselves and party agency and their ability to work within different political opportunity structures. And this is actually taking the party back into the equation and trying to understand how these parties can act as strategic actors in and of themselves, and how they can vary in terms of organizational capacity to, to potentially court more votes. However, these in turn also neglect the demand side and assume that voters are kind of this, very easily swayed group that just reacts to whatever the party says. So most recently, there's been more integrated approaches linking party rhetoric and framing to electoral performance, and this is where I'm trying to situate my work. Most of them have been either single case studies or have suffered from different kinds of methodological reductionism, and so I'm hoping to kind of push this forward a little bit. So the theory that I'm working with is what I'm terming strategic tolerance, that these parties are able to achieve broader electoral success through shifts in rhetoric and self-presentation, in particular by shifting towards broader tolerance of certain minority groups and women through their inclusion in their candidate lists and engagement campaigns. These parties are able to construct a sort of safeguard from longstanding claims of bigotry. And then the rights and protections of different minority groups are thus put into conflict with one another. The parties have shifted their discourse towards the protection of some groups at the expense of others. In this way, new groups are claimed in the construction of a seemingly more inclusive form of a previously exclusionary nationalist identity. So, in other words, the rights of kind of empowered women or members of the LGBT community or Jews are being told that in order to preserve their status in these European societies, the only way to do that is by affirming this sort of fierce nationalism that excludes the bad Muslim other. And so in order to understand this phenomenon, I argue that a more integrated approach needs to be employed that takes into account both the strategic actions and frames of the parties and the way these actions are actually perceived by the voters. And so I contend that there are heterogeneous effects of strategic tolerance, that for members of the majority population, individuals will probably be more likely to respond to these changes because of this newfound plausible deniability from bigotry. That, before I wouldn't want to associate myself with the National Front because that would mean that I might be a racist, but look, they have these black candidates, they have all of these, my black friends are here, so, clearly I can't be a racist. And then for members of different ethnic and religious minorities and sexual minorities, I forgot that there, individuals will or will not respond to these appeals based on which elements of their identity they tend to privilege more. So are you saying that your Frenchness is potentially more important than your religion or any other sort of identity that will kind of go with this this disconnect? And so my research design, I've been conducting interviews with party officials, activists, and voters to be able to understand the scope of this phenomenon on the ground. And then I'm in the process of starting a content analysis of public statements and social media activity of these radical right parties over time. And then this will be then used in a time series cross-sectional analysis of changes in party electoral performance and societal perception in relation to these changes in discourse and candidate demographics. And then finally, I'm trying to actually look at the causal mechanism in play, employing a survey experiment testing the effect of variation in this party discourse, either in terms of who the speaker is of a potential of a particular form of rhetoric, or what the actual content of the message is, or if funding becomes abundant, both, in order to kind of test the causal mechanism in play to see how voters are actually responding, as opposed to having kind of this black box. So fieldwork conducted so far, I was in Germany and Berlin in September and October of 2017 around the most recent federal elections. So it's nice to have all of these Germany making choices signs around. So I was doing interviews with the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, with representatives that were elected into the Berlin House of Representatives, which is kind of the city-state parliament, and the AfD candidates for the Bundestag elections in Berlin, and then interviews with activists in the youth movement, and also doing some participant observations at campaign stops around East Berlin and at a Oktoberfest party, which was terrifying. It was the first event that I tried to go to, and it, just for illustrative sake, there were what seemed like very normal people inside of the event, but waiting outside were mostly a bunch of skinheads. And it was a very telling kind of experience of all right, well, maybe this party has a few things that they're still working on in terms of party image. And so I was then, following that, I was in Marseille, or in France, in Marseille, Provence, and Paris, again, doing interviews with the National Front, regional municipal councilors, and members of the political and executive bureaus, interviews with activists from the youth division, and I was able to find one interview with one female Muslim Front National supporter, which was fascinating, and this was kind of where my project initially started, and I can't write an entire dissertation on this one woman, unfortunately, but it was a really fascinating interview of listening to her as she kind of grappled with how she had to really distance herself from her self-understanding of herself as a Muslim, as there are these new bad Muslims that are coming, and I was a good Muslim, and I came here and did the right thing, and they're ruining it all for me. And so in order to, make sure that I retain my place in French society, I need to vote for the National Front. And so general impressions from the interviews, I'm still trying to figure out the best way to incorporate them. So the interviews largely conformed to my general theories. The representatives with whom I spoke, they echoed these discussions of a more inclusive form of nationalism and really went out of their way to show, we are not racist, we're not Nazis. Again, here's my gay friend, here's my Jew, and it's, clearly we can't be bigoted. There's a lot of differences in party discipline. The professionalization between the Front National and the AFD representatives and their respective attitudes towards me. The AFD representatives, the party was only founded a few years ago, and they're still a bit of a ragtag bunch. So I had people that would show up to interviews in sweatpants and sandals, and we would meet in an ice cream parlor in a shopping mall. And they would sit and talk to me for 3 hours about everything that they ever thought about the heating situation in the local elementary school. And then, on the other hand, you would have in France, where I went to an event where it was a meeting of the FN Jeunesse, the youth movement, where every single person that walked through the door came up to me and asked me if I was a journalist and what organization I worked for. And still I said, no, I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic. And still, they would just kind of walk away and just kind of glare at me the whole night. Again, they were also more likely to toe the party line and not really deviate from what the party apparatus was saying overall. And the most disconcerting thing, I think, to me was the general normalness of the majority of the individuals with whom I spoke. They weren't nasty people. They weren't, and granted, some of this is kind of the privilege that I come into as a white woman coming in, that they're not going to necessarily come at me with the same hostility that they might somebody else. But in general, people really did seem to think that they were doing the right thing and that they were not hateful people, which I really wanted to hate them going in. And it's yes, I fundamentally disagree with everything you stand for, and I think you're misguided, but it's unsettling. And it makes it kind of that much harder to deal with. And so kind of the conclusions and questions that are kind of raised at this point are thinking are these observed changes the result of true ideological changes in the party, or are these kind of window dressing? And then subsequently, if these are not just mere window dressing, or actually even if they are, and people are responding to this and joining the party and voting for them, at what point have these parties actually changed? Do they change? Do they continue to be radical? Do they become more normalized? And if they become more normalized, what does this mean? And then similarly, and this is kind of a question that's been on the bottom too, of what happens when new and old divisions within the parties clash? Are more extreme elements going to drop out, form their own parties, or are they just going to continue to be included within? So, not really sure. And, yeah, I'm really looking forward to questions and comments, and thank you.